The silence in the hospital was a thick, suffocating blanket, broken only by the rhythmic, artificial sigh of the ventilator. That sound had become the soundtrack to my life, the metronome counting out the seconds, minutes, and hours since my world had imploded. My husband, the man I had loved since we were awkward teenagers fumbling through our first dance, lay motionless in the bed beside me. His face, usually so animated and full of life, was a pale, still mask. The doctors used words like traumatic brain injury, prolonged coma, and uncertain prognosis. To me, they were just sterile, clinical terms for a shattered heart. We had been married for 12 years, building a life together brick by brick. We had just celebrated our anniversary, a quiet dinner at our favorite little Italian place where he'd gifted me a delicate silver locket. He defastened it around my neck, his fingers warm against my skin, and whispered that his heart was inside it, always with me. Now the locket felt heavy, a cold weight against my chest, a constant, chilling reminder of what I had lost or was losing. The accident had been senseless, a drunk driver running a red light. A single moment of someone else's recklessness had ripped through the fabric of our existence, leaving a gaping, ragged hole. For the first week I lived at the hospital, existing on stale coffee and the kindness of nurses who looked at me with pitying eyes. I rarely left his side, holding his limp hand, talking to him, reading to him, playing his favorite music, hoping that somehow my presence would pierce through the fog and guide him back to me. His parents, however, saw my vigil differently. From the moment they had arrived, their faces grim masks of grief and accusation. I was an outsider. My mother-in-law, a woman who had always viewed me with a thinly veiled disdain, as if I had stolen her precious son, made her feelings clear from the start. She would sweep into the room, her presence a whirlwind of expensive perfume and sharp, critical glances, ignoring me entirely as she fussed over her unconscious son. She'd rearrange his pillows, smooth his blanket, and speak to him in hushed, dramatic tones, casting me as a mere spectator in a tragedy where she was the lead mourner. My father-in-law was a quieter but no less formidable force. A man who measured worth in bank statements and social standing, he had never approved of his son marrying a librarian. In his eyes, I was not ambitious enough, not wealthy enough, not enough. His disapproval was a constant, low hum in the background of our marriage, a hum that had now grown into a deafening roar in the sterile silence of the ICU. They began to undermine me in small, cruel ways. They'd bring him food he couldn't eat, telling the nurses it was his favorite, a subtle jab at my own cooking. They would forget to include me in conversations with the doctors, huddling together in the hallway, their backs turned to me, their voices low and conspiratorial. I tried to ignore it, telling myself they were grieving, that their behavior was a product of fear and pain. I was grieving too, my own heart a raw, open wound, and I didn't have the strength for a fight. I just wanted my husband back. The turning point came a week after the accident. I had finally gone home for a few hours at the insistence of a kind nurse who told me I would collapse if I didn't get some proper rest. I showered, the hot water doing little to wash away the bone-deep chill of exhaustion and fear. I changed into fresh clothes and was about to head back to the hospital when my mother-in-law called. Her voice was cold, devoid of any warmth. "We've made some arrangements," she said, her tone leaving no room for discussion. "There's no need for you to be at the hospital constantly. We'll take care of him from now on. We've hired a private nurse to be with him when we can't." I was stunned into silence. They were pushing me out. "I'm his wife," I finally managed to say, my voice trembling. "I want to be there, and you've been there," she replied dismissively. "But it's time for the family to take over. This is too much for you to handle." It wasn't a suggestion, it was a command. When I arrived back at the hospital, the atmosphere was even frostier. A new nurse I didn't recognize was in the room, and my in-laws were speaking with the head of the department. They turned as I entered, and my father-in-law stepped forward, his expression unyielding. "We think it's best if you go home," he said, his voice flat. "We've got this under control." He handed me a small box. "You should probably pack your things." I looked from his cold eyes to the box and back again, confusion warring with a rising sense of dread. "Pack my things? What are you talking about? Our home?" My mother-in-law scoffed, a short, ugly sound. "It was never your home, it's our son's home which we helped him buy, and since he is incapacitated, we are taking responsibility for his affairs." The cruelty of her words stole the air from my lungs. Our home, the one we had painted together, the garden I had so lovingly tended, the life we had built within those walls, she was erasing me from it with a few casual, brutal sentences. They had it all planned. They informed me that since the house was in my husband's name only, a decision made early on at their insistence for financial planning purposes, I had no legal right to be there without his consent, and since he couldn't give it, they, as his next of kin, were taking over. I was escorted from the hospital room by a security guard they had preemptively called, their faces impassive as I was led away like a criminal. My protests were ignored, my pleas falling on deaf ears. That night I found the locks changed on the home I shared with my husband. A few trash bags containing some of my clothes, my books, and a few personal items were left on the porch, a final, humiliating gesture of my dispossession. They had not just kicked me out of the hospital, they had kicked me out of my life. I stumbled away in a daze, the locket on my chest now feeling like a lead weight, a symbol not of love but of my utter desolation. I had lost my husband to a coma, and now I had lost my home, my life, everything we had built together, at the hands of the very people who should have been my allies in this nightmare. I found refuge at my sister's small apartment, collapsing onto her sofa, the sobs I had been holding back finally racking my body. It felt like the end. They had taken everything. They had counted me out, dismissed me as a powerless, grieving widow in waiting, but as the initial shock and despair began to recede, it was replaced by something else, a slow-burning ember of anger. They had underestimated me. They saw me as just a quiet librarian, a meek and mild woman they could easily push aside. They had forgotten one crucial detail in their cold, calculated plan. They had forgotten about the legal documents we had drawn up years ago, a precaution we had taken after a friend of ours had gone through a similar medical crisis. In their haste to erase me, they had overlooked the one thing that gave me all the power, the durable power of attorney for healthcare. I was not just his wife, I was his legal medical proxy. They may have taken the house, but I held his life, his future in my hands. In that moment, huddled on my sister's couch with nothing but a few garbage bags of my former life, I knew this was far from over. They wanted to fight. They had no idea what was coming. The next few days were a blur of frantic activity and simmering rage. I contacted our lawyer, a kind, elderly man who had handled our wills and the power of attorney documents years ago. He was appalled when I told him what had happened. He confirmed what I already knew: the document was ironclad. I had the sole legal authority to make all medical decisions for my husband. His parents had no legal standing whatsoever. The hospital, he explained, had likely been misled or bullied by my in-laws, who had probably presented themselves as the primary decision-makers. Armed with this knowledge and a certified copy of the power of attorney, my first move was to re-establish my rights. I didn't call the hospital. I didn't confront my in-laws. That would have been too simple, too direct. They had played a cruel game, and I was going to play one of my own. Instead, I focused on gathering my resources. I was locked out of our joint bank account, another casualty of my father-in-law's swift and ruthless takeover of his son's affairs. But they didn't know about the separate savings account I had maintained since before we were married, a nest egg I had diligently contributed to from every paycheck. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. It was my war chest. My sister was my rock, her outrage a mirror of my own. She helped me find a small, furnished apartment to rent, a temporary base of operations. While I was physically displaced, I was mentally fortifying myself for the battle ahead. The anger was a strange fuel, sharpening my focus, burning away the helpless despair that had initially consumed me. I spent hours at the public library, my old sanctuary, researching. I read everything I could find about traumatic brain injuries, experimental treatments, and long-term care facilities. I was no longer just a grieving wife, I was a general preparing for a campaign. My in-laws, in their arrogance, remained oblivious. I learned through a sympathetic nurse, one who had been kind to me in that first week and was disgusted by their behavior, that they had been lording their newfound authority over the hospital staff. They had demanded a private room, questioned every procedure, and were already talking about moving my husband to a facility of their choosing, one closer to their home, 100 miles away. They were systematically cutting me out, not just from his present, but from any potential future he might have. They wanted to control the narrative, to be the saviors who nursed their son back to health, while I was relegated to a forgotten footnote in his life story. The knowledge that they were planning to move him, to take him even further away from me, solidified my resolve. It was time to act. My lawyer drafted a formal letter to the hospital's administration enclosing the power of attorney. It was a cease and desist of sorts, informing them that all communication and decisions regarding my husband's care were to go through me and me alone, and that his parents were to be granted no special access or authority. They were to be treated as what they were, visitors. Just visitors. I didn't deliver it myself. I had it sent via a legal courier. I wanted the impact to be official, impersonal, and shocking. I can only imagine the scene: the hospital administrator receiving the letter, the dawning realization of their legal misstep, the panicked phone call to the head of the ICU, and then the confrontation. The moment my mother-in-law and father-in-law, in the middle of dictating orders to a nurse, were politely but firmly informed that their authority had been revoked. I pictured the confusion on their faces turning to disbelief, then to sputtering rage as the hospital staff, now legally bound to follow my directives, informed them that from this point forward all decisions would be made by me, his legal wife. I received a furious phone call from my father-in-law less than an hour later. He didn't even say hello. "What is this? What have you done?" he bellowed into the phone, his voice vibrating with indignation. I let the silence hang in the air for a moment before I replied, my own voice calm, measured, and cold as ice. "I've done what my husband and I decided was best years ago. I am simply exercising my legal right as his wife and his chosen advocate. You seem to have forgotten that." "You have no right," he sputtered. "We are his parents. We know what's best for him." "The law disagrees with you," I said simply. "And more importantly, my husband disagreed with you. That's why he signed the document. He trusted me, not you, to make these decisions for him." There was a choked sound on the other end of the line, and then my mother-in-law's shrill voice cut in. "You little snake, you did this behind our backs. After everything we've done, we took you in." "You took nothing," I retorted, the anger I had suppressed for so long finally bubbling to the surface. "You threw me out of my own home with my belongings in trash bags. You tried to erase me from my husband's life while he lay helpless in a hospital bed. You talk about what's best for him, but all you've cared about is control. Your control is over. From now on, you will speak to me before you speak to his doctors. You will be allowed to visit during regular visiting hours just like everyone else, and you will not make a single decision regarding his care. Is that clear?" I didn't wait for an answer. I hung up. The silence that followed was filled with the pounding of my own heart. It was a declaration of war. They had thrown the first punch, a knockout blow they thought would leave me down for the count. But I was back on my feet and I was ready to fight. They had no idea how far I was willing to go to protect the man I loved and to make them regret the day they ever thought they could cast me aside. The battle for my husband's future had just begun. The aftermath of that phone call was immediate and seismic. The hospital, now acutely aware of their legal position, did a complete 180. Overnight, I went from a persona non grata to the sole point of contact. The doctors who had previously addressed my in-laws now called me directly with updates, consultations, and decisions. When I walked back into the ICU, armed with legal authority and a newfound resolve, the nurses who had witnessed my humiliation now looked at me with a mixture of respect and awe. My in-laws were relegated to the waiting room, their faces thunderous. My mother-in-law tried to intercept me as I walked towards my husband's room, her hand shooting out to grab my arm. "You can't do this," she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. "He is our son." I stopped and looked down at her perfectly manicured hand on my sleeve, then met her gaze. "And he is my husband," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "And legally that means everything. Please take your hand off me." She snatched it back as if burned. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted, and we all knew it. The small victory was intoxicating, but it was just the beginning. Now I had the power, but with it came immense responsibility. My husband's condition was unchanged. He was stable, but still locked away in the silent prison of his coma. The doctors at the current hospital were good, but they were beginning to talk about long-term care, about moving him to a facility that was essentially a warehouse for the hopeless. This was my in-laws' plan, I realized. Get him into a nearby facility where they could control the visits, manage his assets, and wait. But I refused to accept that. I spent every waking moment I wasn't at his bedside researching. I delved into medical journals, online forums for families of brain injury patients, and news articles about cutting-edge neurological research. I learned about specialized rehabilitation centers, places that didn't just offer palliative care but actively worked to bring patients back from the brink. I found one, a renowned institute in another state, famous for its aggressive, innovative, and often successful approach to coma and TBI patients. It was expensive, astronomically so, but it represented a flicker of hope in the overwhelming darkness. This became my new mission. I initiated the process of having my husband's medical records transferred for evaluation by the institute. This, of course, required navigating a mountain of paperwork and dealing with the hospital administration, who were now treading very carefully around me. My in-laws found out about my plan, not through me, but through the hospital grapevine. The explosion was nuclear. My father-in-law ambushed me in the hospital parking lot one evening. He blocked my car with his own, his large, imposing figure radiating fury. "Are you insane?" he roared, his face purplish with rage. "You want to move him halfway across the country to some experimental quack factory? We will not allow it." "You don't have a choice," I replied, refusing to be intimidated. "It's the best facility in the country. It's his best chance." "Or would you rather he be moved to the long-term facility you picked out, the one that smells of bleach and despair, so you can conveniently visit on Sundays after church?" He was taken aback by my directness. "We are trying to be practical. This institute will bankrupt him. You're going to squander every penny he has on a fantasy." "It's my penny to squander," I shot back, the words tasting like righteous fire. "Or have you forgotten that while you were changing the locks on my home, you failed to lock me out of my legal right to manage his finances in a medical emergency? The power of attorney covers that too. Every penny he has, every penny we have, will be used to give him the best possible chance at recovery. I will not let him rot in some forgotten nursing home while there is still a glimmer of hope." The look on his face, a cocktail of shock, fury, and dawning horror, was something I would cherish. They had assumed my power was limited to medical decisions. They had no idea the document he had signed so long ago gave me control over his entire estate for the duration of his incapacitation. Their plan to control his assets, his money, had just gone up in smoke. They had locked me out of the house, but they had inadvertently handed me the keys to the entire kingdom. The fight escalated. They hired a lawyer of their own, a shark in a tailored suit who began sending threatening letters, challenging the validity of the power of attorney, claiming I was emotionally unstable and not fit to make decisions. They were trying to paint me as a hysterical, grasping wife, willing to bankrupt my husband for a sliver of false hope. It was a classic, ugly strategy, but I was prepared. My own lawyer was steadfast. We countersued, filing for a restraining order against my in-laws for harassment, citing the incident in the parking lot and their constant, disruptive presence at the hospital. A judge granted a temporary order, legally forcing them to keep their distance and communicate only through their lawyer. The small, sterile hospital room became my fortress. I created a world for him within those four walls. I filled it with photos of our life together, our wedding, our travels, our goofy selfies. I read his favorite books aloud, the worn pages of familiar comfort. I curated playlists of his music, from the classic rock he loved to the cheesy pop we used to sing along to in the car. I talked to him constantly, telling him about my day, about the fight I was waging for him, assuring him that I was not giving up. The nurses told me I was a force of nature. In truth, I was running on fumes and a desperate, defiant love. The institute in the other state finally approved his transfer. The logistics were a nightmare. It required a specially equipped medical transport flight, a team of flight nurses, and a level of coordination that stretched my abilities to their limit. And the cost was, as my father-in-law had so elegantly put it, astronomical. I had to start the process of liquidating some of our shared assets. This was the moment of truth. My in-laws' lawyer filed an emergency injunction to block me from accessing the funds, claiming I was mismanaging the estate. We were heading to court. The day of the hearing, I sat on one side of the courtroom with my lawyer, and my in-laws sat on the other, flanked by their expensive legal shark. They looked at me with pure hatred. My mother-in-law was dressed in somber black, as if she were already in mourning, a piece of performative grief that made my stomach turn. Their lawyer argued that I was emotionally compromised, that my plan was reckless and not based in medical reality. He presented me as a desperate woman clinging to straws, willing to sacrifice my husband's financial future for a one-in-a-million shot. When it was my turn, I didn't let my lawyer do all the talking. I took the stand. I spoke calmly and clearly. I didn't talk about my emotions. I talked about facts. I presented the research I had done, the institute's success rates, the detailed treatment plan they had proposed. I presented testimonials from other families who had been in my position. And then I looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady, "my husband is a fighter. He has always been a fighter. He would not want to be given up on. He would want every chance, no matter how small. The plan his parents have is to put him in a comfortable room and wait for him to die. My plan is to give him a chance to live." Then I played my final card. I addressed my in-laws' claim that I was unfit, that I didn't have his best interests at heart. I looked at my father-in-law. "When my husband was in a coma, a man who can't speak for himself or defend his wife, you and your wife kicked me out of our home. You threw my belongings in the trash. You tried to bar me from his bedside. You locked me out of our life. You did all of this not out of concern for your son, but out of a desire for control over his assets. Your actions speak for themselves. You talk about protecting his finances. You were trying to secure them for yourselves." The judge looked at my in-laws, whose faces had gone pale. Their lawyer was shuffling his papers, avoiding eye contact. The judge read the power of attorney document carefully. He looked at the police report I had filed about the parking lot incident. He looked at the eviction notice which they had foolishly had their lawyer send me, formalizing my removal from the house. The judge's decision was swift. He denied their injunction. He upheld the power of attorney in its entirety, granting me full control over both medical and financial decisions, and he made the restraining order permanent. He looked at my in-laws and spoke in a tone that was dripping with disapproval. "This woman is fighting for her husband's life. I suggest you stop fighting her and start praying she is successful." I walked out of that courtroom feeling 10 feet tall. I had won. I had secured his chance. As I passed my in-laws in the hallway, my mother-in-law looked at me, her eyes burning with impotent fury. "You will regret this," she whispered. "When all the money is gone and he's still lying in that bed, you will have nothing and no one." I just looked at her, a deep, profound pity replacing my anger. "You still don't get it," I said softly. "He is not a bank account. He is my husband, and if I have him, even just the possibility of him, I have everything." The medical transport was scheduled for the following week. It felt like I was breaking him out of prison. As the arrangements were finalized, I sat by his bed, holding his hand, the locket warm against my skin. "We're going on a trip," I whispered to him, my voice thick with emotion. "It's going to be hard and I'm scared, but we're going to do this together. Just hold on, I'm coming to get you." On the day of the transfer, as the transport team carefully moved him onto the gurney, I caught a glimpse of my in-laws watching from the far end of the hospital corridor, kept at a distance by hospital security. They looked small and defeated. They had tried to take everything from me, but in the end I was the one walking away with the only thing that truly mattered. As the ambulance doors closed, sealing us inside, I knew we were leaving more than just a hospital. We were leaving behind their bitterness, their control, their hopelessness. We were flying towards a chance, however slim. It was a terrifying, exhilarating leap of faith, a journey into the unknown with my silent husband at my side. The new facility was a world away from the bleak, sterile environment of the local hospital. It was a place built on the foundation of defiant hope. The air itself seemed to hum with a different kind of energy, a focused intensity. Here, patients were not just maintained, they were challenged. The walls were covered not with generic art but with photos of success stories, patients who had arrived in a state similar to my husband's and were now pictured walking, talking, smiling. It was the first time in months I felt a genuine sense of optimism, a feeling so potent it almost brought me to my knees. The first few weeks were an exhaustive blur of evaluations, meetings, and the beginning of a relentless therapy regimen. They put him through a battery of tests, mapping every corner of his brain, seeking any flicker of activity, any pathway that could be coaxed back to life. My role shifted from a guardian at the gate to an active participant in his care. I learned how to perform range of motion exercises, how to communicate with him through touch, how to recognize the subtle, almost imperceptible changes in his muscle tone or breathing that could signal a response. The days were long and grueling. I would spend hours at his side, working with the physical therapists, the speech pathologists, the occupational therapists. I became an expert in his care, an extension of the medical team. The money was draining away at an alarming rate, a constant source of low-level anxiety in the back of my mind. I sold our cars, I sold stocks, I cashed in retirement accounts. Each transaction was a painful reminder of the life we had lost, but also a necessary sacrifice for the future I was fighting for. My in-laws, silenced by the court order, faded into the background. Their lawyer would occasionally send a formal inquiry about his status, which my lawyer would answer with a brief clinical update. They were a distant, rumbling storm that had passed. I had no energy to spare for them. Every ounce of my being was focused on my husband. There were dark days when the sheer hopelessness of the situation would wash over me. I'd watch his still form, the ventilator sighing its lonely rhythm, and a wave of despair would hit me so hard I'd have to leave the room to keep from breaking down in front of him. But then there would be a glimmer, a finger that twitched when I held his hand, an eyelid that fluttered in response to my voice. The doctors cautioned me against false hope, but I clung to these moments like a life raft. They were tiny sparks in the darkness, and I fanned them with every fiber of my being. 3 months into our stay, it happened. I was reading to him, my voice a low murmur in the quiet room, when I felt a faint pressure on my hand. I stopped, my heart pounding. I looked down. His fingers, which had been limp in mine for so long, were curled ever so slightly around my own. I squeezed gently. "Can you hear me?" I whispered, my voice choked. "If you can hear me, squeeze my hand." The pressure increased, a weak but undeniable response. Tears streamed down my face, hot and fast. It was the first real communication, the first sign that he was in there somewhere, fighting his way back. That small squeeze opened the floodgates. Progress became a slow but steady trickle. A few weeks later, his eyes opened. They were unfocused at first, gazing blankly at the ceiling, but they were open. Then came the day he tracked my movement as I crossed the room. A doctor, a brilliant but reserved neurologist, saw it and allowed a rare, small smile to grace her lips. "He's in there," she said. "The work is just beginning." The work was harder than I could have ever imagined. The process of weaning him off the ventilator was terrifying. Helping him learn to swallow again was an exercise in patience. The first time he made a sound, a guttural, hoarse noise, we all cried. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I was his constant. I was his memory when his own was a tangled mess. I would show him pictures, tell him stories of our life, reintroducing him to himself, to us. There were moments of profound frustration and confusion for him, and moments of heartbreaking despair for me, but we pushed through them together. His parents, upon hearing of his progress through their lawyer, petitioned the court to be allowed to visit. I fought it at first, the raw wound of their betrayal still tender. But looking at my husband, who was slowly, painstakingly reconnecting with the world, I knew it wasn't my decision to make alone. I agreed, but with strict conditions. The visits would be short, supervised, and I had to be present. The day they walked into his room for the first time was tense. He was sitting in a specialized wheelchair, still weak, his speech slow and slurred, but he was aware. My mother-in-law burst into theatrical sobs. My father-in-law stood stiffly by the door, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. My husband looked at them, a flicker of recognition in his eyes, but it was distant. They were strangers from a life he couldn't quite grasp. They tried to take over, to fuss over him, but he turned his head away, his hand instinctively reaching for mine. In that moment, the truth was laid bare for all to see. I was his anchor, his safe harbor. They were ghosts from a past he had left behind. Their visit was awkward and short. They didn't know how to talk to this new version of their son. They couldn't see the warrior in the wheelchair, they only saw the damage. As they were leaving, my father-in-law paused and looked at me. "The money," he said, his voice low. Is it all gone?" I looked at him, and for the first time I felt nothing but pity. "Most of it," I said truthfully, "but look what it bought." I squeezed my husband's hand, and he squeezed back, his eyes on me, a small, slow smile forming on his lips. My father-in-law had no reply. He simply turned and walked away. The years that followed were a testament to resilience. My husband never made a full recovery, not in the way you see in movies. He was left with a permanent limp, a weakness on his left side, and a slight tremor in his hand. His speech, though clear, was sometimes slow. But he was alive, he was present, he was him. We had to sell our old house, the one my in-laws had kicked me out of. It was a painful decision, but it was tainted with bad memories and was no longer suited to his physical needs. We used the last of our money to buy a small, accessible one-story house in a quiet neighborhood. We learned to live a new life, a different life, but it was our life. We were poorer in material wealth, but richer in ways that truly mattered. We found joy in small things, a walk in the park, cooking a simple meal together, watching the sunset from our little porch. His parents kept their distance. The chasm that had opened between us was too wide to bridge. They had shown their true colors in my darkest hour, and that was something neither my husband nor I could ever forget. One evening, about 5 years after the accident, we were sitting on our porch. He reached over and took the silver locket that I still wore every day. He fumbled with the clasp, his fingers still not as nimble as they once were, and opened it. Inside were the tiny pictures of us from our wedding day. He looked from the pictures to my face, his eyes clear and full of a love that had survived the unimaginable. "You saved me," he said, his voice soft but sure. "You never gave up on me." I leaned my head on his shoulder, the familiar weight of him a comfort I had once thought I'd never feel again. "You were always in here," I whispered, touching the locket. "You just had to find your way back." He smiled and pointed to my chest. "No," he said, "my heart was with you. You carried it the whole time." I closed my eyes, a profound sense of peace settling over me. They had tried to take everything. They had kicked me out, thrown me away, and left me with nothing. But they were wrong. They hadn't left me with nothing. They had left me with the one thing that truly mattered, the power to fight for the man I loved. And in winning that fight, I hadn't just saved him. I had saved myself. We had lost a fortune, but we had found something far more valuable in the wreckage. We had found a love that was forged in fire, unbreakable and true. Thanks listening this story. Now I want to hear your thoughts in the comments. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear right now. Share this story with your friends and don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to Revenge Laura for more episodes.